Hello and welcome to the Invertible Counterpoint video. This is the last of the counterpoint videos that we'll be using two voices. After this, we will be further expanding into three voices where we will be thinking about triads, and then also expanding into four voices where we can still be thinking about triads and how we're going to use those notes in the chord in four voices, or also using seventh chords with four voices. From there will be a lot of videos on using four voices, like I was saying with triads or with seventh chords. Then we'll further develop into certain rhythmic and chordal devices that you can use to further expand on certain things we've been taught, like passing tones, neighboring tones, and suspensions, and now putting those into chords, doing suspension chords, anticipation chords, and even auxiliary chords, which you can think about as an auxiliary tone, like a neighboring tone chord. That will lead us into applying this into actual contrapuntal song forms, such as the Canon, or other types of imitative counterpoint, such as the Fuge, where the idea of the Fuge can be rather simple in its very basis form, and you can compare it similarly to sonata form, interestingly enough, where you do have an exposition, a development section, and a recapitulation, but fugues can get a lot more complex. Tag along if you want to see this process further developing. And that's also where invertible counterpoint comes in, because the applications for invertible counterpoint include types of imitative counterpoints, where certain melodies, motifs, and themes will be passed through different voices throughout the piece. Here we see an example from the one-to-one counterpoint video that almost works as invertible counterpoint. This is Schubert's counterpoint composed over Salieri's Dorian Cantus Firmus. And here we can see his response below the Cantus Firmus. As you can see, it is almost identical except for one note. Things become more obvious when we write out the intervals. So now we can see each of the intervals originally written above the Cantus Firmus. So of course that would be the top number of each of those intervals, and then below that you have the inverted interval of the same interval down an octave. So this becomes obvious why Schubert chose to change the note that he did when you understand inverting at the octave. We can easily accomplish this by writing out the numbers 1 through 8, and then below that writing the numbers 8 through 1 backwards. This gives us perspective on what happens when each of these intervals invert at the octave. Now this might seem really simple if you know your inversions at the octaves, but this method of creating the chart will become very useful later on in this video. As we can see at the octave level, the same exact note is just written one octave down. Therefore, when we originally had an octave, now you can see it just turns into a unison. We don't have any seconds or sevenths in here, being one-to-one counterpoint. We don't have dissonances yet, but you can see that the second and seventh are inversions of each other at the octave. If you know your inversions at the octave, this is just straightforward and really easy, but it's going to get a little more complex later on in the video. Understanding your inversions at the octave is useful for more than just this though. It helps you read music, make sense of certain intervals that may be in different locations. Let's say you have certain notes of a chord that are mixed up, or let's say you have certain notes that are distanced very far apart, or even sevenths, for example. Understanding your inversions at the octave is just extremely useful, and there's only 8 of them, so it's really not that complicated. Furthermore, it makes sense because when you look at it, everything that inverts to an interval that will be treated the same way. So let's look at this. The octave inverts to a unison, so you will actually treat those very similarly. Next, the second and the seventh, they're both dissonances. You're going to treat those similarly as maybe a passing tone, neighboring tone, or a dissonant suspension. And thirds go to sixths, and you know that oftentimes in chords, you're building 1, 3, 5, so all thirds, or oftentimes in these exercises, you're avoiding your second inversion triads, your 6/4 chords, but you are doing your first inversion triads, your 6 or your 6/3 chords, talking figured bass. So that all checks off. Octave to unison, straightforward. Second to seventh, dissonant. And third to sixth is your consonant. So you can see where these are used similarly, but the problem occurs when you go to the 4th and the fifth, or the fifth to the fourth. Of course, because these are inverting into each other when you're transposing down an octave. So normally we would treat a fourth as a dissonance. So when a fourth goes to a fifth, that's not much of a problem. The problem is when we compose using the fifth interval, because when it transposes, it turns into a fourth. So if you don't pay attention to how you're using it, it will turn into a improperly treated dissonance, which is something we're avoiding in these exercises. Further down the road, when you're making your own compositions, you might want to add some dissonances on some strong beats for certain reasons. But also throughout these videos, I'm going to be teaching you how to make dissonances on the strong beats, but in a way that's going to work harmonically. So you're going to be able to use dissonances, but also make your music make more sense to the listener harmonically if that's what you're going for. Of course, you may not be going for that, but if that was the case, you probably wouldn't be watching this video. So we're really going to be highlighting harmony in these videos, and the harmony of this is going to be based on triads, seventh chords, inverting, all that. But with that, you already have a ton of stuff there. Then you expand when you get into major and minor, you have even more stuff. You get into things like raising your leading tone of just first starting your minor. Now you have the harmonic minor, but then things get even more interesting. You start getting into modes. We're teaching modal counterpoint for the most part, with some tips and tricks from tonal counterpoint. But with that, you're seeing things like here, it was a D Dorian cantus firmus. So when you start getting into modes, you have even more options, even some more different patterns of chords using your notes, different sounds using the same notes and scales, where things get interesting because the only modes that you would not want to raise your leading tone in are Ionian and Lydian. Other than that, all the other modes you might want to raise the leading tone in order to create that leading tone function, and also possible dominant function with the 5 chord. Of course, that's going to be for another video, but that's an interesting topic because some of the chords in certain modes will actually turn into more usable chords, or maybe ones that have function you'd want to use more. Let's say a major 5 when you raise that leading tone. So look out for that on another video. The whole point is with staying in the harmonics, which theoretically are based off the harmonic series, we already have a ton of options to play with here. From here, if we understand all this stuff and further develop into things like quartal harmony, not chordal, but quartal, like 4, using fourths, or quintal harmony using fifths, other things, microtonal harmony, or maybe even different tempered scales, we could start interweaving some of the knowledge that we have of the current tonal system that we use here in the West that has been developed for thousands of years. So before we start jumping into a bunch of other crazier things, we might want to do that later on, but if we keep our feet in these territories where we're understanding harmony a lot, then that probably is going to help us later on, no matter what route we choose to go on. Furthermore, practicing these counterpoint exercises is not only good for creating counterpoint, good voice leading, it's also a good exercise for practicing reading in different staffs, writing bass lines that work, writing melodies over that also work. Just having an understanding of harmony and using certain notes in the right places. So this goes way more than just counterpoint, especially counterpoint exercises, but this really starts to give you a lot of perspective just into harmony, how harmony works. Furthermore, with understanding that fourths and fifths are going to invert into each other at the octave, that gives us perspective on why Schubert changed that one note that he did. As you can see in the inverted response, we have a fifth. So if we took that same note and we inverted that for the original response, we would have a fourth. A dissonance on the strong beat, something that is completely unallowed in one-to-one counterpoint. So now we can see that Schubert repeated the C sharp, which is something you also want to avoid in a one-to-one counterpoint response, repeating any note, but it allowed him to avoid that dissonance. You might think, why did he not just choose to create a sixth? That is speculative, but you can see that if he did, it would also create a repeated note of an F, which in a second we can see why him choosing to repeat the C sharp instead would especially be a better choice if this response was intended to be inverted at the octave. Pay attention to what happens every time the interval goes over an octave. As you can see, in every case this happens, it creates a brief voice crossing. Of course, in a moment where it stays over an octave, it's not going to be so brief of a voice crossing. This is something we want to pay attention to. Many teachers, including Fuchs, taught to not form any intervals larger than an octave when composing for these invertible counterpoint exercises at the octave. So these exercises, maybe don't practice it when you're doing your responses, or pay attention to them, see how they sound, and decide if it's something you want to use. Additionally, 10th intervals can be very useful, especially when wanting to create more of a leap, like we see in here. But when you're thinking with counterpoint, a lot of things come at a double-edged sword. So yes, you'll create more interest, and maybe that voice will actually stick out more, going up higher, being further spread out from the other voice. But like we see here, we invert at the octave, now we have voice crossings. So mainly just be aware that this will happen and make your own conclusion from there. To sum it up, all of these responses are going to work as long as we treat fifths like dissonances, so that when they are inverted into the fourth, they are treated properly. So now we're in a position where we can think, what would our responses look like if fifths were dissonances? If we lived in a world where fifths were actually dissonant, what would all of our responses look like? This is the perspective you're going to be in when you're making these responses. Instead of having the options to choose what interval you're going to have as your first note, when inverting at the octave, you must begin on scale degree 1. This is so that when it is inverted, now the tonic is in the bass, or in other words, the very lowest note of the interval. And of course, this is the beginning and the end, so your very first note and your last note will begin on scale degree 1. So now we're going to have a look at the 3 types of voice-leading dissonances in perspective of the fifth being a dissonance. So here we can see the fifth acting like a passing tone. Not only does it occur on the weak beat, but it is also approach and left in the same direction, filling in that span of the third. So we see that the passing tone is treated properly, and when it is inverted, we can see that it turns into a properly treated fourth passing tone. Same thing, it is approached and left in the same direction, the nature of a passing tone. And then dissonant neighboring tone, which is pretty simple. As you can see, the sixth interval goes down to a fifth and back up to a sixth. The sixth and the fifth being adjacent intervals that are both consonant are very helpful when we're wanting to use our fifths like dissonances, because we can always use our sixth like a consonant and the fifth will always be one step away, allowing us to use that passing tone from the sixth to the fifth, as well as the neighboring tone. Then we can see that when that inverts below, that it turns into a dissonant neighboring tone that is treated properly. So the passing tone and the neighboring tone are pretty simple. Preparing, suspending, and resolving a note, creating a suspension, is a little trickier because you're treating your fifth like a dissonance. So therefore it has to resolve down. As you can see, when that resolves down, it resolves down to a fourth interval. That's a dissonance when we're writing above. So of course, the whole point of this is it works when we're writing above and below, so we have to compromise, and we have to go one more step to a third interval to where it resolves properly. So you can see this is no longer resolving on beat 3 with a half note, but it's stepping down to beat 3 and then resolving on beat 4 when above. Now this works especially well because the fourth is a dissonance that is acting as a dissonant passing tone. It's on beat 3, which is perfectly fine even in the parameters of these exercises, to have a passing tone on beat 2, 3, or 4 as a quarter tone in a 4/4 time. And then as the fourth resolves into the third, all in steps, then it's like the fifth is still resolving into the third. Because the fifth isn't going to the fourth and then leaping into a resolution or anything. When you're doing steps, it's almost like a note merging into another note. So yes, that fourth is there, but the fourth is just a passing tone, merging from the fifth to the third with that brief dissonance. Then when this is inverted, we can see that the suspension turns into a proper 4/5 suspension, which additionally just goes down another step to a sixth. So everything works out perfectly there. So we can see a similar thing to where the fourth is resolving to a sixth, and it's passing through that fifth along the way, and in some sense holding out that 4 and going down resolving on the sixth might imply a 4/6 chord. The last thing to note from this example is that the fourth occurring on beat 3 is technically an accented passing tone, which I think it's really good to have dissonances on those stronger beats when possible. Dissonances make it really interesting. So if you possibly choose to write as many dissonances as possible, and as many on those stronger beats as possible, then you have a possibility of having a lot more interesting of a response. So we can see inverting at the octave is pretty simple. The same note is just now below, so you're literally thinking about the same note just flipped down, which in a lot of cases we probably already as musicians have been used to doing this a lot. We can see that all we have to do is treat the fifths as one of the 3 types of voice leading dissonances, and then it will invert at the octave perfectly fine. Now if you start thinking about fourths inverting into fifths, the idea of avoiding parallel fifths might arise. There's only one scenario that I can think of where this would actually be a problem, and this would be a very specific scenario. Furthermore, to accomplish this, you'd have to start bending some of the rules a bit, but in a way that can still be justified harmonically, so I think it's worth mentioning because it's a realistic scenario that you might choose to do. So first, you'd have to be prolonging a harmony that has already been established. From here, you can create dissonances on the strung beats. And this means whether you're in a 2-to-1 ratio or anything bigger than that, then you're able to create your dissonance on your strung beat. After previously in a measure, that harmony has already been established. So what are we looking at here? So we can see C is established, which goes through a double passing tone of a 7th and a 6th as 2 eighth notes, landing on that 5th. So far harmonically we can see C and G, probably what's being established here. Furthermore, we have a 4th, probably not a harmonic tone, probably a passing tone, as we can see it's acting as a passing tone, passing on to the next interval where it's also creating another 4th. So it's being approached and left in the same direction, but the thing is it's creating a 4th. But since the given melody's going down a step and the note's going down a step from a 4th, you have your parallel 4ths. But the whole point is then that goes to your 3rd, so it resolves on a consonance, and the dissonance was a note that belonged to a C major 7 chord. C, E, G, B. We can see the B and the E, 2 notes that belong to a C major 7 chord. All the other notes I was talking about belonged to a C chord. So this is creating that 7th. So we can see some rules are being bent, but it still works. So that's the whole point. We still have dissonances, and they're not only being justified harmonically, but they're being used as passing tones. Each of the 4ths are being approached and left in step. So when thinking about them as justifying as a dissonance, you can see it's still acting as a passing tones. And now we can see that if we invert that idea, now we have parallel fifths. So this is the one time that parallel fifths would occur when you invert at the octave. Now seeing the intervals written out, you might think you'd do something clever and lead all the way from your 4th interval and then go down an octave from where you normally would be at your next 4th interval, and then from there continuing down, still in the same note that the passing note would have gone to, but just an octave down. The problem with this is that now you have a 5th interval that is being approached in direct motion, specifically similar motion, but there's a bigger problem, and it gets worse the more that you look at it. The top voice is leaping into the 5th, leaping down a dissonant 9th. The octave is the largest interval we're taught to use in these responses, So not only does it go over that, but it's using a dissonant leap. We also don't want a dissonant leap, so it's going against both of those. And then the top line is leaping into the fifth with similar motion, as well as it's doing a voice crossing. So there's a lot of things going on, and of course this just looks like a bad example, but in counterpoint it's often good to look at bad examples. Because as you can see on a simple basis, without getting into the specifics of things, we can see it makes sense where you'd have your fourths being justified, and then maybe here you'd go from your fourth to your fifth, but just seeing these presented to you makes you think of what not to do, which is just a really good thing to comprehend. Before you begin to compose your own responses using invertible counterpoint, let's look at Fuchs's response given in his book Gradus ad Parnassum. We're going to listen to this in a second alongside the inverted version. Fuchs chooses a simple execution by simply avoiding using the fifth interval overall, almost entirely throughout his response. He actually only includes one of them here, as you can see in the intervals written out. This is in measure 8, where he uses a 6-5-6 neighbor note pattern. So the fifth is being used as a neighboring note, a consonant neighboring note, which is perfectly fine up above. So now let's listen to this melody, the response up above, and then we'll listen to the response below, and we'll listen to how they both sound side by side. So you probably noticed that basically sounded identical. And you may have also noticed that it just sounded different when it got to measure 8, when that passing tone now got turned into a dissonance versus a consonance. So you can see already to where if you have an established motif, song idea, or maybe theme, when it's then inverted, then each time one of those fifths gets inverted, it's now going to be a dissonance, so it's going to have a different sound to it. So of course, if you start adding a lot more fifths, that same melody you remember is going to sound a little different, but it's still going to work. So that's a sort of nuance that can change up your melody that you've written. And not only does the fifth turn into a fourth, but we can also see that originally we had a 7-6 suspension up above in the original response, and when that inverts below, we see a properly treated 2-3 suspension. So you can see this actually plays off the suspension elaboration up above. It's a plain 7-6 suspension using the elaboration that anticipates the resolution tone, dips below it, and then back up to it using 2/8 notes. And being a 7-6 suspension, it's going from that sixth down a note to a fifth, and then going back up to the sixth, just a regular suspension embellishment, but that fifth is now being treated as a neighboring tone. So you'll start to see where these ideas taught in these lessons start to weave together and work together as well. And now we have moved on to invertible counterpoint at the 10th. And it's the same thing to where if we create that table 1 through 10 on the top and then 10 through 1 backwards on the bottom, you'll see how the intervals line up and what happens when we invert at the 10th. Before getting into all the details, it's good to know why this is useful. When one wants to compose imitative counterpoint such as fugues and canons, knowing how to write counterpoint that can invert at more than an octave comes in handy. The two most common types of invertible counterpoint at more than an octave are the 10th and the 12th. The 10th being an octave plus a third, and the 12th being an octave plus a fifth. So now that we have that table constructed, we can see what happens when we invert everything at a 10th. Conveniently, all the dissonances invert into other dissonances. But when we look a little further, we can see that the thing to pay attention to are the imperfect as well as the perfect intervals. All of the imperfect intervals invert into perfect intervals. Because of this, now all of the perfect intervals now invert into imperfect intervals as well. You can probably suspect what this means, but let's further elaborate. If your melody has a nice chain of consecutive sixths, now that's going to become an unwanted chain of parallel fifths. In order to compose a melody that will properly invert at the 10th, we will have to treat every imperfect consonant interval as it is a perfect consonant interval. So now we have a similar question as before, but this time, what if we lived in a world where all consonances were perfect? What would our responses look like? What would our music look like? This parallel reality is just a funny way to remember a little better of what's going on here. So now our response must begin and end on scale degree 3, but not as a third, but a 10th. A third is not a good choice because it is so close to the given melody's note. This is why in the very beginning one-to-one counterpoint video, I taught that you can have some problems if you start to compose with your median as your starting note, because you can start with your 10th, but that seems like not a proper choice unless you use it in the circumstance where you're going to be inverting at the 10th. Because we're going to see that starting and ending on scale degree 3 does not work so well as when you use a fifth or an octave to start or finish. So that's just why you might hear some people saying, oh, you can start your counterpoint response on the median, and well, that is true, but it probably fits into certain scenarios. Additionally, now when we invert our counterpoint response down a 10th, it now begins and ends on scale degree 1, in the bass line, or the lowest note. Okay, so now let's listen to the response for the 10th that we just looked over, first above and then below, so we can listen to them one after another. And here's just both the melodies on top and below. I just want to show this if you want to pause the video and maybe look at this, compare how the top interval inverts to the bottom interval. Of course, we're staying diatonic here, so when we're inverting down within the same scale. This can further develop where you invert everything down a certain interval, say a minor third. I'm going to further talk about that at the end of the video. So now I'm just going to go back to where we can see the response where it's inverted down the 10th. We can now see the response functioning as a moving bass line. It begins and ends on scale degree 1 now, so everything's looking good. The one thing is that when it's above, it's weird starting and ending on scale degree 3, like I was saying, trying to establish a good beginning and especially an ending. This can pose a challenge when wanting to create a clear cadential ending. One solution could be using a quarter note cadence formula that is found and borrowed from the 4-to-1 exercises. Treating each consonant as it is perfect means that no downbeats forming a consonance can be approached in direct motion, meaning that is in similar motion or parallel motion. Because of this, every downbeat must be approached in either contrary motion or as a suspension, which will suspend the note causing oblique motion. When the melody is transposed down a 10th, the result is a rhythmic line that works as a bass line starting and ending on scale degree 1. Next we have an example by Fuge that is pretty clever. This works when inverted by the octave or the 10th. Of course, we can see it begins on scale degree 1, so that would work when inverting at the octave. Yes, I know it's beginning on scale degree 1, and then you're thinking about inverting at the 10th. I'm going to explain that in a second. There's only 1/5, and it functions as a passing tone. Now let's listen to this, and always try to pay special attention to the interval that will form into a dissonance, in this case, the 5th, and just how it changes when inverted. Now you might wonder, how can this be inverted at the 10th when it begins on scale degree 1? This is why this response is so interesting. Let's first just look at when we invert by the octave. When we do this, the response is functionable as a rhythmic bass line. The perfect unison is used maybe more frequently than one would want, but this still serves as a good example to think about what is possible. So now let's listen to the response a tenth below. We can analyze that it's going to work by making sure that each downbeat is approached by contrary or oblique motion. This is because all the consonant intervals invert into perfect intervals and vice versa when inverting down the 10th. The only exception is if you had a dissonance on beat 1 of a measure that is justified as a dissonance, such as the situation of a prolonged harmony talked about earlier in the video. If you miss anything, just look below and there will be timestamps of chapters throughout the video. In that case, the dissonance is justified and furthermore will invert into another dissonance. Let's simply look at a C major scale to make more sense of this. When we write the notes before and after the beginning tonic note of C major, we can easily go back those two notes from C, creating a third back, and we'll see that scale degree 1 down a third is just scale degree 6 when we're dealing with major. Of course, when you go into a different mode such as minor, things will be different. Going 6 down a third, well, you'd be at the 4th interval in minor. So we see that we're starting on a new scale degree, but we're maintaining the same notes in the key, so that will change us into a different mode. The only thing is you might see the very last note at the end. That's going to be explained, and it'll make sense if it does not already. With the response now beginning and ending on scale degree 6, it is now functioning as a rhythmic bass line in the minor mode. So it's easy when we look at C major because we see it starts on A, we have a C above that, so it's creating a third, but with A on the bottom and C on the top, it now is putting it in the minor mode. This now will sound like it's minor. And now that explains why the last note is a G sharp, because G sharp is just the raised leading tone in A minor, creating that lead tone function. Now if you're raising the leading tone to make it the harmonic minor, you need to be careful that you're not using it as the same time as another G is playing, especially if they're occurring at different octaves. In that case, you're going to have false relations. No matter what, the whole point is to establish a certain key or mode in these exercises. We're not really modulating yet, and we're sure not using the same mode as an altered version and an unaltered version at the same time, which is what would occur if you started having the G sharp and G natural at the same time. Interesting enough, you can combine the responses from above and below, keeping the given melody in the middle, and the result will be a 3-voice texture. In this basic state, the melodies are traveling in parallel tenths of each other, but with some creativity, you could vary the original idea to create 3 different melodies that work. So let's give this a listen. So you can see that worked. The whole point of these exercises is not that, oh, it sounded like the best rememberable melody. When you start to do your own compositions, your own voice is going to show a lot more. But for now, we're just writing melodies that work. So if they sound a little cheesy, don't worry about it. The whole point is that harmonically everything works. There's not random intervals that just don't sound right. Furthermore, with how we have been trained through these exercises, now the melody has clear points to it where we have different rhythmic values creating interest. Things like leaps up to high points, where it's held out a little bit, faster moments, and then slower moments at places like the beginning and the end and the high point, like I was saying. So we're using all this to make it sound more musical. And you could think of each of these responses as a potential idea for something you might develop in a piece, or at least being in that mindset. Often when writing a piece, it can be a very good strategy to develop a good bass line and then a melody over that. And these exercises are teaching us how to write a melody over a bass line that we already have. Something that is very useful. Because we'll see that creating a bass line can be very simple. But we're also seeing that the bass line is helping us create this melody. So with that, once we go on our own, we can start to create our own cantus firmus, which I will have a video about soon. It's very simple. And then from there, you can begin to write your own responses over your own cantus firmus, making your own counterpoint responses, or like I was saying, the basis to an idea. And actually, if you check my counterpoint playlist, in one of the first few videos, I explained the nature of the cantus firmus. And to basically sum it up, in most cases, a good cantus firmus is just highlighting the tonic triad chord. So whatever key, if you're using C major, those would be the notes C, E, and G, the 1, 3, and 5 of the tonic chord in the root position. That is what the cantus firmus is going to be highlighting. We can see that here as we're looking at this one. This 3-voice combination works for any response that is invertible at the 10th, whether that is a response written to be inverted at the 10th, starting on scale degree 3, or like in this case, a melody written to be able to be inverted at the octave and 10th, written on scale degree 1. When written for the octave and 10th, it just means that when the response is placed below, it will cause everything above it to be minor, which gives perspective to having a bass line originally in minor inverted up a 10th, as well as flipping between major and relative minor if the responses for an octave and 10th shift between above and below the given melody. So you probably wouldn't want to keep shifting major and minor, but maybe you have a passage that plays something in major, and then you have a different passage that plays it maybe in a different instrument, in a different voice, but below the same given melody, and all of a sudden now you have a minor version of the same thing. And just a tip about that works in theory, but not all melodies that you're going to write are going to sound good when they're transposed into minor. And some of the main points that won't sound good are when you start using dissonances and then start changing that into minor. Things get further complicated when you start to do things like modulations originally in major and then go into minor. So a good tip for if you want to transpose a melody from major into minor is that you could do a rhythmic reduction of your melody and then transpose it into minor, and then from there you could further work with that bass idea and make it sound how you want to. Especially if from the bass idea you started doing some interesting chords, modulations, borrowed chords or stuff like that. Because when you start shifting stuff like that into different modes like minor, things just are not going to work the same way. And now inverting at the 12th. Invertible counterpoint at the 12th is very useful when wanting to compose fugues. Very often in a fugue, the material of the subject and countersubjects are transposed by a fifth. So pay attention to that transposed. So again, we can create a simple chart just using the numbers 1 through 12 placed on the top, 12 through 1 backwards on the bottom, and we can compare how the intervals invert at the 12th. The perfect 12th inverts into the perfect unison. We can see the second goes to the 11th. The 11th can be thought of as a compound fourth, so those are both going to be used as dissonances. The third inverts into the 10th. Those are both imperfect consonances. And furthermore, the 10th is just a compound third. So very similar there. The 4th goes to a 9th. 9th is like a compound second, both dissonant. And the perfect 5th goes to the perfect octave. Everything works perfectly until we get to the 6th and 7ths, where 6ths go to 7ths and 7ths go to 6ths. Therefore, 6th intervals must now be treated as dissonances. So now we need to think about, what if we're in a world where 6th intervals are dissonances? What would music look like? What would our counterpoint responses be like? And the reason why I'm saying this is because you can compose an invertible melody that's not just working as counterpoint, but you could simply just take a melody that works written as invertible and then some other point in the song just invert the melody below now. And yes, that is technically invertible counterpoint, but it's just the idea that if you follow these basic rules, these guidelines, then you can write a melody that works up and down. So it does not have to be limited to just thinking about fugues and canons and contrapuntal forms of writing. Since we're transposing an octave plus a 5th, the 12th, we have to begin and end on scale degree 5. This will invert into scale degree 1 as a baseline. When treating 6th as dissonances, we will have to use them as a function of one of our 3 types of dissonances taught for these exercises. So you'll notice we had to do this for the octave, and now we have to do this for the 12th. Because in the octave, a 5th inverts to a 4th, a dissonance. So we're doing what we did with the octave with the 5th, but now with a 6th. So it's actually similar. It's not that hard to remember because of that. But furthermore, you'll notice that we did not do that to the 10th. The reason being that consonances and perfect intervals invert into each other at the 10th, and dissonances just remain dissonance, all of them. So it's the octave and the 12th where we're using these dissonant devices. A scenario where a 6th can act as a passing tone is pretty simple and does not take much creativity. Again, a 6th is adjacent to a 5th, in other words, it's a step away, allowing you to use it as a passing tone very easily. So now when you have a 5th, and you have the chance to use the 6th as, like here, a passing tone, so here we can see the 5th is traveling up a third to the next measure. The next measure is a 10th, which is irrelevant, because what matters is how the 6th is approached and left. It's a passing tone, so it's approached and left in the same direction. It's treated as a dissonance. So that's all we have to do, just treat it like a dissonance. In all, it's very simple, and we can see that when that's transposed down, then that turns into a passing tone of a dissonant 7th. Where now it's an octave going through a 7th, and then to the next interval, which is on the downbeat. So in all, it's similar function to where we have a perfect interval with a passing tone going to an imperfect consonant interval. The only difference is the passing tone being consonant above and then dissonant below. And similar to that, using a 6th as a neighboring tone, again, is very simple. Here we have a 5th going up to a 6th, going back down to a 5th. We have 2 5ths on the outside. The bottom voice is traveling oblique. That checks off, and then the fact that it's a 5th with a neighboring tone means that it's basically just the 5th interval being embellished with the 6th. When that's inverted down the 12th, we can see now the 5th becomes an octave, the 6th becomes a 7th, back down to the octave again, which was originally the 2 5ths, so same thing, 2 octaves now in the outside perfect intervals, but it's really just an embellishment of that interval. Both times you can see that the 6th acts as a consonant passing tone or neighboring tone when written above, but then it becomes a properly treated dissonance when inverted below. And there's nothing wrong with consonant passing tones or neighboring tones. In fact, sometimes that is just the result of what is happening when you're trying to accomplish something in what you're writing. Because for now, this is taught in a tonal counterpoint approach, as well as just being 2 voices. But when you start to think more modal counterpoint, then you start to think as passing tones, more passing in between chord tones and not consonant intervals. Same with neighboring tones and suspensions as well. When a note is suspended, creating a sixth interval as a result of this suspension, it must resolve down to a harmonic fifth, being treated like a dissonant suspension. That is easy to do. The problem is that when it is inverted, it becomes a 7/8 suspension. That is normally completely avoided in counterpoint. And a 7/8 suspension occurs because it's on the bottom voice, because a suspension is always going to resolve down a step. When it's in a lower voice, this results in the interval traveling up a diatonic step. And then when it's written above, it causes the suspension to travel down a diatonic step because it's getting closer to the interval it's above now. When it's below, it's getting further away from the interval it's below. To sum that up, 7/8 suspensions in a lower voice are completely prohibited in these counterpoint response exercises. And this goes for more than Fuchs. This is actually written in many books as a mistake in these counterpoint responses. Therefore, invertible counterpoint at the 12th should only use sixth intervals as passing and neighboring tones. The suspension should be avoided since it will result in a 7/8 suspension when it is inverted down a 12th. To make this concept work, one could use a retardation in place of a suspension. This is not taught in these exercises, but simply speaking, a retardation is a suspension that resolves upwards. Many times you'll see people talking about suspensions, they'll resolve them up or down, but if you really want to get technical, a retardation is a suspension that resolves upward. Now this kind of gets into territory like a glissando versus a portamento on a violin, where some people really aren't going to care. They're just going to call it a glissando, and they might even just call it a portamento as well. And they sound the same, so it makes sense. So this is territory where it depends on who you talk to. Some people are just going to call it a suspension if it resolves up or down, really doesn't matter to them. But in fact, the retardation is allowed in one circumstance in these counterpoint exercises. That is when you're in minor and the chromatically raised leading tone is the note being suspended as a dissonance, allowing it to resolve up to the tonic as a resolution. Fuchs's example of invertible counterpoint. Here we have an example of invertible counterpoint at the 12th, and as you probably guessed, now we're going to listen to it. Okay, so you might have noticed that sounded a little different and it looks a little different. So there's a little bit to unpack here. And just like normally on this channel, the theme of how I explain things, when I get to the complicated parts of what's going on, I'm going to try to explain things as simply as possible, simplify it to where it still describes what is going on, and then I'll dive into deeper analyzing what is actually going on and comprehending, as well as further understanding why this is actually working and why things are actually happening the way that they are. Okay, so first of all, we can observe that Fuchs only used the interval of a sixth twice in the entire response. Both of these times they are functioning as passing tones. And of course we know the rule for those. The response begins on scale degree 5. It ends with a raised G turning into G sharp. You can simply think about this as a borrowed leading tone from A minor. This is especially effective because when this is transposed down a 12th, that borrowed leading tone will invert down a perfect fifth, in other words 7 semitones, to the leading tone of the key being used. So in this case we're starting in D Dorian. Of course D minor also begins and ends on D with a raised leading tone, but the difference is that D minor has B flat as scale degree 6, while D Dorian is the same thing as D minor but with a B as scale degree 6. This is because compared to Ionian, which is major, Dorian has a flat 3 and a flat 7, while also compared to major, minor has a flat 3, 6, and 7. So if you take any major scale and you flatten the 3, 6, and the 7, now you turn that into a minor version of the same scale. So if it has a natural 6 with a flat 3 and a flat 7, then it is a Dorian, not a minor. But now you have to pay attention to what happens when the response is inverted by a 12th. And don't worry, we can make sense of this. It's not as complicated as you might suspect. So now, as you look, we have B flat. Why? We need to think about how this happened. To simplify it, the melody was transposed down a perfect fifth. So let's just simply think what happens when you take a scale and you transpose it down a perfect fifth. Well, you're going down the circle of fifths. If you had to C, you'd be going to F. So you're going to the relative key on the plagal side. So now if we think about the response being transposed down a perfect fifth, we can just think of a fifth below each of our notes in the response. With the actual key signature being used as C major, this makes it really easy because you can actually see all of the flat or sharp notes occurring as accidentals. Okay, so now I'm going back to the original response, which was written a fifth above. Since this was transposed down a perfect fifth, I'm going to write a fifth below each of these notes, and we're going to see what happens. So more than just the intervals, if we actually look at the C major scale, this is going to help a lot. So as we can see, B flat is the only note that got changed. This is because if we think about a perfect fifth below every note of the C major scale, we'll see a perfect fifth is formed below every single note in the scale besides F. And this is because the 7th degree of the scale is a diminished chord. So when you go from the 7th degree up, you have a diminished chord. As we can see, that's what happens when we go F down. And F is a fifth above B. Therefore, if we're transposing down a fifth, in this case a compound fifth, then we need to comprehend this fact, that one of the scale degrees is going to change in the mode that we're using. In this case, we're using Ionian, major. Since the response we originally wrote is not going to change, and that's being transposed down a fifth, then the note that's going to change is the note that reacts to being transposed below what we wrote. In other words, there's one scale degree in every mode that we're going to use that is going to cause a different interval to result below it when we transpose down a fifth. In major, we can see this is going to be scale degree 4. If we simply think about A minor, we can then see that shifts to scale degree 6. Because again, we're transposing down a perfect fifth. If we write those perfect fifths below it, it gives us insight on the fact that BDF is a diminished chord, therefore we need B flat. All that is the reason why now we have B flat when we transpose down. Okay, so now we made sense of that, but now looking a little deeper, we see, wait, we started in D Dorian, and then we ended up transposing to a key with B flat. Not only does it have B flat, but it also ends on a C sharp and starts on a D natural. So that gives us perspective on the fact that we're using D minor here. Now, okay, now things might start to get kind of weird. Whoa, we started in D Dorian, then we used a borrowed note from A minor, and then all of a sudden we transposed down a fifth, and now we're in D minor. So we went to a parallel mode. Okay, so let's just try to simplify this as much as we can and slowly make sense of it. I'm going to provide some more scales that we can look at. C major, A minor from before, but now we're going to be looking at D major and D minor, then with D Dorian. With all of this, it will help us make sense of all this. It's actually not that complicated. So we started in D Dorian. What is D Dorian? It's a mode of C major. It just uses the same notes as C major, but it starts on D and it ends on D. Yes, you can raise the leading tone, of modes except for Ionian and Lydian, but that is irrelevant here because we borrowed a raised leading tone from minor, something we're already used to. We have that G sharp indicating a borrowed leading tone from A minor, also a mode of C major. So everything checks off. We're in C major. The G sharp raised leading tone of A minor is irrelevant for a few reasons. One is that it's the penultimate note. It occurs one time right before the last note. It does help with the lead tone function, but in the case of the top melody, it's a borrowed note. And furthermore, it's irrelevant because to be minor, it doesn't have to have the raised 7th degree. That does help establish it, because oftentimes you have a melodic minor, but you still have minor if you use natural minor. Therefore, without that raised leading tone, when we're transposing down that 5th, it's still D minor. So we need to not think about that so much, okay? That's just a raised leading tone, minor, doesn't really matter. Second to last note. What we need to really think about is, on simple terms, if we're using a mode of C major and we're using all of the notes that are going to be in C major, okay, like we take all the notes in C major, we transpose those down a perfect 5th. We're just taking the notes that are in C major and transposing them down a perfect 5th. As we probably know, the result of taking a scale and transposing it down a perfect 5th, like I discussed a little earlier, is just going down a key on the circle of fifths. So again, in the case of C, we're going to F. Okay, so that makes sense. If we go from C, we go to F. F major has B flat in its key signature. We can see that's the note that we ended up with. So to explain this in other words, this makes sense because D Dorian is a mode of C major and D minor is a mode of F major. And you're just transposing what you had down that perfect 5th. Remember, it's down a perfect 5th. So from where you're starting, to comprehend that, you might want to think up a 4th is the inverted version of that. That's where these octave inversions come in handy in other terms as well. So now what happens if you want to invert by the 12th and stay in the same key? There's a few ways you can do this. You could just avoid scale degree 4 in major completely. Not establishing this will allow you to transpose everything down a perfect 5th without any notes that are going to change to be outside of the original key that you were working in. Additionally, you could do the same thing as the 6th degree in minor. This could be a simple and useful method. Or you could use both of those. You could use scale degree 4 in major or scale degree 6 in minor, no problem, but you could just transpose everything down a diatonic 5th, in other words, staying in the key and not going down a perfect 5th. So everything shifts down on the staff, on the lines or the spaces, just a 5th down, but it stays in the same key signature. So if you want to get real technical, you would be transposing scale degree 4 in major and scale degree 6 in minor down a diminished 5th to stay within the key and still using those notes. And then to modulate to the relative key, just like we talked about, you shift everything down a perfect 5th, resulting in a modulation to the plagal relative key. Like we talked about, if we're in C and we shift the C major scale down a perfect 5th, or go down a 5th on the circle of fifths, we have F major. Now you might think, okay, how do we go up a 5th? It's the same thing but backwards. All we do is we write a melody that is written so it can be transposed up a 12th, and doing so, shifting it up a perfect 12th, will shift it into the relative dominant key, or shifting it up a 5th up the circle of fifths. And well, how would you go about that? It's really not all that difficult. It's sort of the same thing. Since your 6th and 7th intervals invert into each other at the 12th, then no matter if you're starting below or starting above, when you write your 6th, you're always going to treat it like a dissonance. And of course, in any circumstance, you always treat your 7th already like a dissonance. Therefore, when it flips and becomes a 6th, it's also treated properly. Furthermore, you just start on scale degree 1 because you're transposing now up a 12th. So it's still working as a baseline where you wrote it, but then it's working above the given melody starting at the fifth above compared to an octave below. And again, just think about it like you have a melody on the bottom that's in a certain key. You're taking that melody on the bottom, just think of it like a key, and you're transposing all that up a perfect fifth. Now you're in your different key, your dominant relative key. Okay, we're finally done with the invertible counterpoint video. I wanted to spend time kind of describing things, breaking things down, discussing some nuances that might occur. All these little things are going to be helpful because a lot of it is questions answered. Furthermore, now we have perspective on actually transposing these melodies. Now this can give us many ideas, even just starting from a melody, going down, or like I said, going up or down to either one of those key changes. And then things get really interesting when you start playing with the modes like we saw, with the D Dorian going to D minor. When you really think about that, it's crazy how everything all works. I think music is always like that. It's crazy how all this stuff ends up all working together. Rather mind-blowing, because at the end of it you sit there and sometimes you don't make sense of it and you connect all these dots. And like I was showing you with the C major, A minor, D major, D minor, D Dorian, all that stuff, it all makes perfect sense when you break it down. So from the outside, all this stuff, music, or especially when you get to this level of thinking about melody, when you're thinking about counterpoint and thinking about harmony, it looks really complicated. But when you're on the inside, you realize it is complicated and it is very complex. But where a lot of people go wrong is they think because of that, it's a very difficult topic. But that's not the case. This is a topic that is fairly easy to understand. It's the fact that a lot of people want the end result without the process of going through and slowly understanding everything. Yes, people want to write beautiful melodies, but it really helps when you understand what you're doing. So taking the time, studying all this stuff is only going to help you in the future. May take you a lot longer to start your first song, but when you start writing your song, you might be done with it that night, while the other guy might have been working on his song for the last month and can't figure out what the next part is going to be, or can't figure out why a lot of parts don't sound good, and they're sitting there playing their instrument over and over, trying to make certain things sound good. This is a realistic thing that happens to many people. But when you can simply just sit back and hear something and then think about, okay, what notes were played? And then just comprehend the fact that, okay, I can see why that probably didn't work. Remove the thing that you think probably didn't work from being educated, realizing now it sounds nice, and there you go. So you can see this actually saves a lot of time too. And not only that, but this definitely doesn't limit you. As for one thing, it helps you achieve the sound you actually want to create when you have more tools in your toolbox. Think, how do I create the sound? And you have more ideas helping you get there. But not only that, but all these practice exercises are not limiting you so much. They're actually giving you a bunch of ideas. They are limited in the fact of the exercise that you have these rules that you have to follow. But that is a learning process. Because then by the end, the student understands, okay, when I'm in a certain scenario, this is what I can do. When I'm faced with a certain challenge, here's some ideas to work around that. Not only that, but just doing these exercises, filling in the intervals, furthermore, getting into the invertible counterpoint, inverting everything and stuff, it's all going to help you practice reading music, thinking about harmony, and like I said, filling your head with a bunch of ideas. So just remember that when someone's telling you you don't need to learn all this stuff to be able to do music, and they might be convincing you actually it's the opposite, you don't want to learn all this stuff, realize not everyone's the same. Certain people want to learn all this stuff, and like I explained, it's probably going to help you out a lot. So that is it for this video, and that is it for the videos on two-voice counterpoint. This has come a pretty long way, so this is pretty exciting. You can check out my florid counterpoint responses as a previous video, as well as other videos. I'm going to have a lot about song forms coming up. I had one about sonata form. I'm going to have one about the sonata, minuet and trio, scherzo. I'm also going to have one about the canon, the fugue, starting at simple fugue, and then we'll be building up from there. And just know that this is not something that is really just going to stop anytime soon. This is going to keep evolving and evolving further. There's a lot to this topic. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. It would help me out a lot. I could use some support. As well as subscribe to see more videos. If you want to make sure you don't miss any of my videos, make sure you have the bell clicked on. And if you have any questions about anything, or if maybe you saw something, and if you don't think it's quite right or anything of those terms, feel free to comment down below. I'd love to respond. Because in these music concepts, here's something that happens a lot. Oftentimes when watching a video, you might think that someone made a mistake because you're not exactly comprehending what's going on. So there's that. There's also the fact that I could have made a mistake. So if I did, please let me know. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to avoid it and also be aware about it. But I'd like to talk and touch about the subject that when I personally watch videos, I've many times thought, no, I don't think this is correct what they're teaching. There's something incorrect. There's something wrong. This isn't adding up, basically. And then after I sit there for a while, most of the time I'll make sense of it. Sometimes I'll walk away from it and maybe I'll think about it all night. It'll keep me up. And then the next morning I'll think, oh, I made sense of it now. And I'd say the majority of the time that I've thought that something was incorrect when I was watching a video that someone put time in preparing, that in fact they didn't actually make a mistake, but I just didn't comprehend exactly what was going on. So always keep in mind that could happen. Until next time, goodbye.